What makes a legend? Is it talent, hard work, or the unshakable belief that one day the world will know your name? For Conor McGregor, it was all of that and more, a story born not in fame or fortune, but in the gritty streets of Dublin, where dreams often withered under the weight of harsh realities. Before the spotlight, before the sold-out arenas and multi-million-dollar fight purses, Conor was just a young man with a pair of gloves, a dream, and a job that barely kept the lights on. He wasn't a superstar. He wasn't a household name. He was a plumber. In the early 2000s, Dublin was no stranger to hard work. Its narrow streets and bustling neighborhoods echoed with the rhythm of people hustling to make ends meet. Among them was a wiry teenager, waking before dawn to trudge through the city carrying the tools of his trade. Day after day, Conor McGregor worked in the trenches, literally fixing pipes and unclogging drains, while the idea of a different life burned in his mind. The world knew him only as a plumber's apprentice, but inside, he saw something bigger. Somewhere between leaky faucets and endless hours on construction sites, the fire was ignited, a fire that would push him to defy every expectation and carve a path unlike anything MMA had ever seen. But chasing a dream isn't easy when your days are consumed by survival. At the time, MMA was still in its infancy in Ireland. It wasn't mainstream. It wasn't lucrative. It wasn't even taken seriously by most. And yet, for Conor, it was everything. He wasn't looking for a hobby or a way to kill time after work. He was looking for a purpose, for a way to channel the frustration of a life that seemed destined for mediocrity. Those who knew him back then would later say that he was different, obsessed even. While his friends were out enjoying their weekends, Conor was in the gym, sharpening his skills, studying fight tapes, and dreaming of a stage far bigger than any local circuit could provide. His passion for fighting didn't come without sacrifices. Family and friends worried about his future, urging him to stick with plumbing, a safe career. To them, fighting wasn't a profession, it was a gamble. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of uncertainty pressed hard against him. The long days of training, combined with the financial strain of a dream that offered no guarantees, tested his resolve. But Conor wasn't one to back down. He often spoke about how belief in himself was his greatest asset, even when others couldn't see what he saw. And as the years went on, his dedication began to pay off. In local gyms across Dublin, whispers about the cocky, confident young fighter started to grow. He wasn't just good, he was different. Conor had a presence that was impossible to ignore. His left hand, sharp and precise, became the stuff of legends in the Irish MMA scene, and his trash talk, that was another weapon entirely. McGregor didn't just fight opponents. He dismantled them mentally before they ever stepped into the cage. Every fight was a performance, and Conor was the star. He wasn't just a competitor, he was an entertainer, a trait that would later catapult him to superstardom. But the path to greatness is never linear. Conor's rise wasn't without setbacks. Early in his career, he tasted defeat, a bitter reminder of how unforgiving the fight game can be. Lesser men might have walked away, but not McGregor. He took the losses as lessons, going back to the gym with an intensity that only grew stronger. Slowly, the plumber-turned-fighter began to make a name for himself beyond Dublin, earning respect not just for his skills, but for his relentless ambition. He was no longer a kid with a pipe wrench and a dream, he was a contender. Then came the moment that changed everything. A phone call from the UFC, the biggest stage in mixed martial arts. For years, Conor had visualized this moment, even when it seemed impossible. He would later talk about how he manifested his debut, picturing every detail in his mind until it became reality. But as exciting as the opportunity was, it also came with immense pressure. This was no local show. This was the UFC, the pinnacle of the sport, where every move would be scrutinized, every word dissected, and every fight could make or break a career. When Conor McGregor stepped into the octagon for the first time, it wasn't just another fight, it was a declaration. From the moment he walked out, his trademark swagger on full display, it was clear that this wasn't just a debut, it was the beginning of something special. That night, in a performance that would go down in history, McGregor delivered a first-round knockout that sent shockwaves through the MMA world. Fans, commentators, and even seasoned fighters were left wondering, who is this kid? And where did he come from? The win marked the start of a meteoric rise, but it was only the beginning. Conor's charisma, his unapologetic confidence, and his ability to back up every word in the cage made him a phenomenon. He wasn't just winning fights, he was capturing the imagination of fans worldwide. Whether you loved him or hated him, you couldn't ignore him. And for McGregor, that was the point. But fame is a double-edged sword, and with the spotlight came new challenges, pressure, expectations, and an ever-growing target on his back. As his star rose, so did the stakes. Every fight became bigger, every opponent more dangerous, and every moment more scrutinized. Yet, through it all, Conor remained unshaken, fueled by the same belief that had carried him from the streets of Dublin to the biggest stages in the world. Still, the question remained, how far could he go? Could the plumber-turned-fighter truly cement his place among the legends of the sport? Or would the weight of his own ambition prove too much to bear? The answers would come in time, but one thing was certain: Conor McGregor wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they couldn't, who had ever been written off before they even got started. And that fight was far from over. As the story unfolds, we'll dive deeper into the moments that defined McGregor's legacy, the rivalries, the victories, the controversies, and the sheer willpower that made him a legend. But first, we go back to where it all began, to a small gym in Dublin, where a young man dared to believe he could rewrite the rules of the fight game. The rise of Conor McGregor is more than just a tale of success. It's a story of resilience, of chasing dreams against all odds, and of the unstoppable force that is self-belief. What happens next, though, might just surprise you. Conor's story didn't truly begin in the octagon. It began long before the lights and cameras, back in the narrow streets of Crumlin, a working-class neighborhood in Dublin. Growing up, he wasn't the confident, outspoken figure the world would come to know. He was a skinny kid with a mop of hair, known more for his quick temper than his quick hands. His childhood was a mix of challenges and camaraderie, shaped by the grit of a community where toughness wasn't optional, it was survival. Even as a boy, there was something restless about him, a kind of energy that couldn't be contained. At school, Conor struggled to fit in. He wasn't much of an academic, often finding himself daydreaming or getting into trouble. But on the playground, in scraps with other kids or games of football, his competitive streak was impossible to ignore. There was an edge to him, a refusal to back down, even when the odds weren't in his favor. That fire, however raw, was already burning. Still, in a neighborhood where dreams often gave way to reality, no one could have predicted what would come next. In his teens, Conor's first love wasn't MMA, it was football. He played for a local club and even dreamed of one day making it big as a professional player. But something wasn't quite right. While others seemed content to play their roles, Conor wanted more. Football wasn't enough. He needed an outlet, something that could channel his restless energy and his growing fascination with the idea of combat. That's when he discovered fighting. At the age of 16, Conor walked into a boxing gym for the first time. It wasn't fancy, just a small room filled with the smell of sweat and the sound of gloves hitting bags. But for him, it was a sanctuary. Under the watchful eye of seasoned trainers, he learned the basics: footwork, jabs, combinations. It didn't take long for everyone to see he had a gift. His movements were fluid, his punches sharp, and his hunger to improve unmatched. In the ring, Conor found something he'd been searching for: a sense of purpose, a reason to push himself to the edge. But boxing alone wasn't enough to satisfy his curiosity. Around the same time, MMA was starting to make waves globally. The UFC had begun to capture the imagination of fans, showcasing fighters who could wrestle, strike, and submit opponents in ways Conor had never seen before. He was hooked. The sport was raw, unpredictable, and demanded a level of versatility that appealed to his obsession with mastering new challenges. Soon, he was training in MMA gyms, learning jiu-jitsu, wrestling, and kickboxing, often traveling across the city to get to sessions. He wasn't just dabbling, he was committing. Still, there were obstacles. Dublin wasn't exactly a hotspot for MMA, and opportunities were scarce. For Conor, that meant balancing his newfound passion with the harsh reality of needing to earn a living. By the time he hit his late teens, he'd taken up plumbing as an apprentice, waking up before dawn to work long, grueling hours. His days were spent crawling under floors, fixing leaks, and hauling tools, and by evening, he'd head straight to the gym. It was exhausting physically and mentally. There were nights when he questioned whether it was all worth it, when the idea of quitting seemed like the only logical choice. But something inside him refused to give up. His family, while supportive, worried about his future. His father, Tony, often told him to focus on his trade, to think practically about life. Fighting wasn't a career. They said it was a hobby, a phase. But Conor didn't see it that way. In his mind, fighting wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. He'd tell anyone who would listen that he was going to make it, that he'd be a world champion one day. Most people laughed it off, dismissing his confidence as youthful arrogance. But those who knew him well understood that Conor wasn't just talking, he was planning. As he began competing in local MMA circuits, it became clear he wasn't like other fighters. Conor didn't just fight to win, he fought to dominate, to put on a show. His striking was crisp, his movement unpredictable, and his trash talk unmatched. He'd stare down opponents at weigh-ins, verbally dismantling them before the fight even began. In the cage, his performances were electric, leaving audiences buzzing with excitement. People started to take notice. This wasn't just a fighter, this was a showman, a personality too big to ignore. Still, the road to success was anything but smooth. Early in his career, Conor faced moments that could have broken him. In 2008, during one of his first professional fights, he suffered a loss that left him questioning everything. For a brief moment, the cracks began to show. The frustration, the doubts, the sacrifices, it all came crashing down. He even considered walking away from the sport entirely, thinking maybe the critics were right. Maybe this dream was too big for someone like him. But in the darkness of self-doubt, Conor found his resolve. He doubled down, throwing himself into training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He studied his losses, breaking them down frame by frame, to understand where he'd gone wrong. He refined his skills, sharpened his focus, and returned to the cage stronger than ever. What followed was a string of victories that would put him on the map, each one more spectacular than the last. By 2012, Conor had captured not one, but 2 titles in Cage Warriors, a European MMA promotion. He became the featherweight and lightweight champion, making history as the first fighter in the organization to hold belts in 2 weight classes simultaneously. It was a statement, a declaration to the world. Conor McGregor was coming. But success in Europe wasn't enough for him. Conor had his eyes set on the biggest prize, the UFC. He'd watched the fights on TV, imagining himself in the octagon, trading blows with the best in the world. He even wrote it down in a notebook, UFC World Champion. It wasn't a wish, it was a promise to himself. And then one day, the call came. Dana White, president of the UFC, had heard the buzz about the brash Irishman with the quick wit and devastating left hand. Conor McGregor had his chance. What happened next would shake the foundations of the sport, but the road to that moment was filled with untold stories of sacrifice, of doubt, and of a relentless belief that refused to be extinguished. As Conor prepared for his UFC debut, the world had no idea what was about to hit it. This was no ordinary fighter. This was a force of nature, a man who had clawed his way from the depths of obscurity to the brink of greatness. The question wasn't whether he'd succeed, it was how far he could go. And as the world would soon find out, Conor McGregor wasn't just fighting for a title. He was fighting to become a legend. The stage was set for Conor McGregor's UFC debut. But the world outside the octagon was far from quiet. As his training intensified, so did the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a fight, it was his shot at proving every doubter wrong, at showing the world that he wasn't just talk. Behind the scenes, Conor wrestled with pressures that no one else could see. His family had sacrificed plenty to support his dreams, but their patience had limits. The financial strain was a shadow that loomed large, a constant reminder that failure wasn't just personal. It could mean going back to the life he'd fought so hard to escape. Even in training, Conor's confidence, though unshakable to most, was tested. As the fight date drew closer, injuries, exhaustion, and doubts crept in. For someone who built his reputation on self-belief, these moments were kept hidden, locked away from the cameras and the fans. Yet, in his heart, he knew he couldn't let himself falter. He'd told the world he was destined for greatness, and now he had to deliver. His opponent, a seasoned UFC veteran, was no pushover. Leading up to the fight, the media was quick to frame Conor as an unproven rookie. The headlines painted a picture of arrogance, of a fighter more focused on flashy words than actual results. But this narrative didn't discourage him, it fueled him. He thrived on the criticism, feeding off the skepticism like it was energy. In the lead-up to the fight, Conor's trash talk reached new heights. He wasn't just hyping the fight, he was playing a mental game, one that his opponent couldn't seem to match. To those watching, it felt like the fight had already started long before the cage door would close. The night of his debut arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Fans packed the arena, many of them curious about the brash Irishman who had generated so much buzz. For Conor, this was the culmination of years of struggle. As he walked out to the raucous crowd, his trademark swagger and confidence on full display, it was as if he had already envisioned this moment 1,000 times. But the stakes were higher than anyone knew. What few realized was that this fight wasn't just about a win or a loss, it was about survival. Conor had bet everything on this opportunity. A poor performance could mean the end of his UFC career before it even began. When the bell rang, it became clear that this was no ordinary debut. Conor fought with a precision and ferocity that left the crowd stunned. His movement was fluid, his striking relentless, and his presence overwhelming. Within minutes, he delivered a stunning knockout, silencing critics and cementing his place as a rising star. The arena erupted in cheers, and the cameras captured the moment as Conor roared into the crowd, arms raised, as if to say, "I told you so." It was the perfect debut, the kind of moment that fighters dream of but rarely achieve. But as the celebrations began, an unexpected twist emerged, one that threatened to derail his momentum. In the post-fight interviews, Conor's charisma was on full display, captivating fans and media alike. Yet, behind the scenes, a quiet storm was brewing. The UFC, impressed but cautious, began questioning whether Conor's confidence might be more than just an act. They weren't just investing in a fighter, they were investing in a brand, and a polarizing figure like Conor was as much a risk as he was an asset. The UFC's hesitancy wasn't the only problem. Back in Dublin, life hadn't magically transformed overnight. Conor's family still faced financial uncertainty, and the pressures of his sudden fame began to weigh heavily. Expectations skyrocketed, and every step he took from that moment forward would be scrutinized. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about maintaining an image, a persona that fans had already started to idolize. To complicate matters, rival fighters wasted no time calling Conor out. His brash personality and rising fame made him an easy target, and challenges came from all corners. One rival, a quiet but lethal striker with years of experience, began making waves, claiming that Conor's success was nothing but hype. The rivalry brewed behind the scenes, fueled by subtle jabs in interviews and social media posts. Fans eagerly speculated about a potential showdown, but Conor, true to form, dismissed the noise, focusing only on what was ahead. What no one anticipated, however, was the toll this rapid ascent would take on his personal life. Fame is a double-edged sword, and Conor began to see both its rewards and its costs. The man who had once been ignored on Dublin's streets was now a global sensation, but with that came a new kind of isolation. Old friends drifted away, unable to reconcile the person they once knew with the figure who now graced magazine covers. Even those closest to him, those who had been by his side through thick and thin, found it difficult to navigate the whirlwind of his newfound success. Amid this chaos, Conor's focus never wavered. But as he prepared for his next fight, whispers of doubt began to circulate. Was he truly ready to face the top contenders in the UFC? Could he sustain the momentum of his explosive debut? And perhaps most intriguingly, could he handle the pressure of carrying not just his own dreams, but the expectations of an entire country? The answers to these questions would come soon enough, but not without a cost. Conor's rise had been meteoric, but meteors burn bright and fast. As the next chapter of his career unfolded, the stakes would only grow higher, the challenges more daunting, and the spotlight more intense. Yet, for Conor McGregor, this was exactly where he wanted to be, on the edge of greatness, with everything to gain and everything to lose. Conor McGregor's rise to superstardom had been anything but conventional, and the challenges that followed his UFC debut only seemed to amplify his hunger. Each fight after that brought higher stakes, tougher opponents, and an ever-expanding audience eager to see whether the Irishman's meteoric ascent would continue or if he'd finally crash back to earth. What set Conor apart wasn't just his skill, but his ability to captivate the world. He wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting to cement his legacy. And soon, an opportunity presented itself that could do just that, a chance at the UFC Featherweight Championship. Standing in his way was Jose Aldo, the reigning champion and one of the most dominant fighters in MMA history. Aldo hadn't lost in a decade, and his stoic demeanor was the polar opposite of Conor's flamboyance. The build-up to their fight was nothing short of theatrical. Conor launched into a relentless psychological assault, taunting Aldo at press conferences, snatching his belt during media tours, and reducing the composed champion to flashes of visible anger. For many, it seemed like Conor had finally bitten off more than he could chew. This was Aldo, after all, a fighter who had built a legacy on dismantling challengers with ruthless precision. The anticipation reached a fever pitch as fight night approached. But then, an unexpected twist shook the MMA world. Aldo pulled out due to injury. The announcement sent shockwaves through the UFC. Fans were devastated, and critics questioned whether Conor could keep his momentum without the high-profile showdown. But instead of folding under the pressure, Conor turned the situation to his advantage. A replacement fighter, Chad Mendes, stepped in, and the fight was quickly rebranded as an interim title bout. Mendes was a dangerous wrestler, and many believed his skill set was the perfect foil to Conor's striking heavy style. When the two stepped into the octagon, the energy in the arena was palpable. The fight was a war. Mendes used his wrestling to control the early rounds, grounding Conor and unleashing a barrage of punches and elbows. For the first time, it seemed the Irishman might have met his match. Bloodied and battered, Conor remained calm, even smiling through the onslaught. Then, in a moment that would define his career, Conor found an opening late in the second round. With lightning precision, he landed a devastating left hand that sent Mendes crashing to the canvas. The crowd erupted as the referee waved off the fight. Conor was now an interim champion, and his star was brighter than ever. But there was unfinished business. The specter of Jos Aldo loomed large, and the UFC wasted no time rescheduling the fight. The build-up to their eventual clash was even more intense, with Conor doubling down on his trash talk, calling himself the true champion and predicting a first-round knockout. Aldo, meanwhile, trained in silence, determined to let his performance speak louder than words. By the time fight night arrived, the tension was unbearable. This wasn't just a title fight, it was a battle for supremacy, for legacy. What happened that night would become one of the most iconic moments in MMA history. The fight began, and within just 13 seconds, it was over. Conor landed a perfectly timed counter left hand that sent Aldo crashing to the mat. The arena erupted in shock and awe. Aldo's decade-long reign had ended in the blink of an eye. Conor stood atop the cage, arms raised in triumph, roaring to the crowd. He wasn't just a champion now, he was a legend. The doubters were silenced, and the world knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. But even in victory, Conor's journey was far from over. He set his sights on an even bigger challenge, becoming a two-division champion. To do so, he would have to face Rafael dos Anjos, the UFC lightweight champion. Once again, fate intervened when dos Anjos pulled out due to injury. Conor, undeterred, accepted a fight against Nate Diaz, a scrappy, unpredictable fighter known for his iron chin and elite jiu-jitsu. The fight would take place at welterweight, a weight class far above Conor's natural division. It was a gamble, but Conor thrived on risk. The fight with Diaz was an instant classic. Conor dominated early, landing precise strikes that staggered Diaz. But as the rounds progressed, the larger, more durable Diaz began to turn the tide. In the second round, Conor found himself in unfamiliar territory. Exhausted and vulnerable, Diaz capitalized, taking him to the ground and securing a rear-naked choke. Conor tapped, and the arena fell silent. For the first time in the UFC, Conor McGregor had lost. It was a humbling moment, but it wasn't the end. In typical Conor fashion, he refused to let the defeat define him. He demanded an immediate rematch, determined to prove that he was still the best. The second fight with Diaz was a war of attrition, with both fighters pushing themselves to the brink. This time, Conor emerged victorious, winning a razor-thin decision. It was a redemption story for the ages and a reminder that even in defeat, Conor's will to succeed was unshakable. With the Diaz rivalry behind him, Conor returned to his original goal, capturing the lightweight title. In November 2016, he faced Eddie Alvarez in a fight that would once again make history. Conor's performance was nothing short of masterful. He picked Alvarez apart with surgical precision, eventually finishing him with a combination that left no doubt about his greatness. Conor had done it. He was now the first fighter in UFC history to hold titles in two weight classes simultaneously. As he stood in the center of the octagon, holding a belt on each shoulder, the world knew they were witnessing the culmination of a journey that had started in a small Dublin gym. But perhaps the most unexpected twist of all came after the fights, after the belts, after the world had declared him a legend. Conor didn't stop. He turned his attention to boxing, stepping into the ring with none other than Floyd Mayweather in a crossover event that shattered pay-per-view records. While he didn't win, Conor proved he belonged on the biggest stage, earning respect even in defeat. Today, Conor McGregor's story is one of triumph, resilience, and audacity. From a struggling plumber in Dublin to a global icon, his journey is a testament to what's possible when belief, skill, and determination collide. Yet, as with any great legend, his story isn't over. The man who rose to the top against all odds continues to chase greatness, leaving fans wondering what the next chapter will hold. And if there's one thing we've learned, it's that with Conor McGregor, the next move is always unpredictable.